we will be taking a look at some techniques we can use to advance our normal maps and give them more detail. We can increase the kind of punch of our normal map that we already have, as well as create detailed normal maps to give the effect of our asset has a lot of detail up close, so that doesn't look really blurry. We will look at slope shaders, also known as up vector shaders, where whichever way we rotate a model, we will always have one texture blending in on the top of our asset. This is great for something like snow or sand or moss. We will take a look at mesh vertex offset shaders and the kind of fun ability we can use these to essentially push or pull our verts down from our mesh, essentially being able to fake added depth to our asset based on just the vertices we already have on our model. This can give some really cool results. We will take a look at parallax shaders and how we can fake the look of adaptive tessellation without the need of the huge performance cost that is generally associated with that. Parallax shaders are great. It can add a bunch of really nice little faked in details. And finally, we'll go over the entire shader network that we built, including our linear interpolating height blended shader creation that we made last week, as well as all of these new advanced shaders, and how we can utilize them to create a bunch of different looks and different appealing assets, all with just one shader. We'll be able to swap out textures on these guys and see kind of how powerful just this one master shader is and how it's going to benefit us in creating our large open environment with many different organic assets. All right, this is a pretty technical week, so let's just jump in right now. Let's go ahead and look at some ways that we can increase our normal map detail on a rock asset, as well as looking at ways we can use normal maps to help enhance our close-up details. So here we have our rock cliff that we sculpted. It just has a very simple diffuse texture on it. Nothing too defined yet. It doesn't have any kind of edge painting in there. Nothing really done much. It's really just the normal map, and that's what we're going to take a look at. You can see that we have all our kind of sculpted detail. It's everything that we got out of ZBrush, and it's a nice one-to-one map. Holds up pretty well from back here. But this being a large cliff, the player's going to get in pretty close, and when you do, you can start to see things kind of break down. The normal map gets a little blurry. The details up close are nothing too great. And even this normal map, you know, once we start putting in really chunky rocks, we might want to like pop out some of this detail, get it to look really nice and kind of really just be a little more exaggerated, so we get some of these forms kind of coming out. So we're going to take a look at how we can go do that. So this is just a very simple material right now. It has our diffuse texture, which is basically just gray. Nothing's been done to it really yet to kind of add anything or highlight anything, because I just want to show you how we can emphasize our normal map as well as our smaller normal map details. It also just has an ambient occlusion plugged in. It's one-to-one normal, and then some roughness and 0 for metallic. So now what we can do is we can come in here to our normal map, and we want to increase basically our normal map's intensity. And to do that, we need a component mask. Now what a component mask does is it'll allow us to isolate specific sections of a given texture. Right now the default is the red and green channel, but you can, you know, switch it up to your red, green, blue, or alpha channel. For right now, we're just going to be dealing with our red and green channel, as that will help us increase our normal map detail. We're going to want to leave our blue channel alone. So we'll just plug in our texture sample, and it's going to be grabbing our red and green channel. If you want to click this little arrow, you can get a preview of what it's pretty much taking out, which is just, again, our red and green. Now, we're going to multiply this by just a constant. So we'll just plug this in here and plug that in there. And we can set the default value to 1, as it'll just be multiplying it by itself, and so we won't really see any change. But when we come in here and we increase this value, we can then get a more intense normal map. And so that's why we'll want to convert it to a parameter and name it something like normal map intensity. Now, to get our red and green channels back into our normal map, we're going to need to append our new normal map intensity back into our blue channel. So we'll use an append node. The append vector is the one you're going to want to use, and this is basically going to be combining back our two channels. So we'll just plug our newly created red and green, and then we'll grab the blue channel, and then if you click the arrow right here, you can see we have our normal map again. Now, of course, since we've left the default at 1, it's not going to really change anything, but with our material instance, we can easily check that out. So just close this real quick, bring up our material instance, and now we can increase the intensity of our normal map. And as you can see, increasing it just like really kind of can up the strength of it quite a lot. It's something you're going to want to do subtly. You don't want to do too much. It's just there to help, give it a bit more pop if it's kind of lacking. But again, you want to keep it pretty subtle, otherwise your normal map will start to look a little weird and goofy. Now that we've increased the strength of our base normal map, we're going to want to look at how we can increase the detail when we're up close, so you don't just get this really low res looking kind of material here. We want to have a bunch of nice detail for when you're up close, and we can do that with detail maps. Now, detail maps are basically just normal maps layered on top of our existing normal map. And to do that, we're going to go back to the content browser and we'll go to our master material. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to again want to use the same technique that we learned here and append some detail normal maps. Now, detail normal maps can be anything that has a bunch of small tiling kind of detail information. We want something that can easily tile a ton of different times and not look too in your face. So you don't want things with huge gouges in them generally. You want things that are kind of a nice subtle thing that just give a little bit of extra kind of noise and detail when you're up close. So for the rocks, I'm gonna just use kind of this texture here. It doesn't have any kind of in your face overt details, and it's got a nice bunch of like little chips and lines that I think will work really well for this. So we'll just bring this texture in. And then what we're going to want to do is, again, we're going to want to use a component mask. We can actually just grab this section here, paste it down here, grab our normal map, place it in here. Again, we'll want to change this to something like normal map detail. And since this is a detail map, we're going to really want to tile these UVs quite a lot, as we don't want to have just these large kind of big shapes. We want it to be a bunch of essentially this normal map tiled really small, so you're just getting the normal map information. So we'll just bring out a texture coordinate, bring out a constant and a multiply. And then so we can set this again as well to a parameter, so we have the ability to change it whenever we want. And we'll just call this normal map detail tile. Plug that into our UVs, and we can set it to just a default value of 5. Now, we want to basically append this new normal map we've created with our old version. Much like our normal strength that we increased up here, we need to append this guy down here, but this time we're going to want to use a constant of 0, as this will act as our blue channel, as we just want the red and green information. Now, to get these all to combine back together, we're not going to append them, we're actually going to add them together, because we're adding on our essential red and green channel on top of this guy. We're adding it to our other red and green channel while keeping the blue alone. So we'll just add in these two and make sure we check it out, make sure that's working. All right, looks like it is. And then we'll plug it into our normal map. We'll click apply and then check out our model. So now, as you can see, we've got a whole bunch more detail in here. And of course, we can come down to our instance, grab this guy, and play around with some of our values. So we can come down here to our tiling, set this to maybe 20. And you can already see that you now get a ton of detail when you get up close. And of course, with our normal map detail, we can set the intensity to whatever we want. So we can have a nice subtle detail, or we can have something pretty intense. But for the most part, this is just really to give you some nice detail when you get up close, so it doesn't like fall very flat. So if we set this as 0, it basically turns off, and you can see how flat and kind of just low res this looks. But we just increase our normal map detail to even something like 0.5, and our asset already looks more high res. And then of course you can just play with the tiling itself and see what really works for you. But this is just a great way to add in a bunch of extra detail that doesn't take away from the main shapes of your own normal map. Again, that's because we're not using the blue channel, and we're not overriding it with the blue channel of our detailed normal map. Just we're using the red and green channels. One of the most powerful types of shader additions we can add to any asset is a slope-based shader. Now, this is also known as a vector up shader, and basically what it does is it projects from essentially any given angle you want, generally from the up position as in your Y downwards, and will apply a material based on your model's normals that are being pointed up. Now, I don't exactly mean just the normal map detail, I mean the actual model normals that are all kind of like pointing out in every direction. So if you have faces and vertices that are pointing up towards the Y direction, it'll essentially layer a texture on top of them. And faces that are pointing out to the side, it won't, as it'll essentially be falling off. Now what this is good for is it's phenomenal for things like snow or sand or moss that you want to have growing on top of your rock. So let's take a look at how we can set this up, as again, it is one of the most powerful features you can add to your assets to give a really nice look. So we'll just come back to our original rock here, and we're just gonna want to go, and since we're going to be doing some snow, we'll just add in some snow, just a nice little snow texture. We're also going to want to bring in our height map of our rock, as we want to use that to be able to blend between the two of these, so it's not just flat snow on top of this. You of course can, but again, height maps just give a lot of extra detail. So we can just close that out and then come back here. Now of course with our height map, again, we're going to want to take the inverse of our height map so that the snow will kind of fill in the crevices first if we want to like interpolate that blend. So we'll just bring up a 1 minus so we get the inverse of our height map. And of course if we want to be able to play with the kind of strength of this, we can bring in a power node. Just click the, I guess it's not the P key, So just search power real quick, bring in a constant, and set this just to a value of 1, convert it to a parameter, call this height contrast. And plug that into our exponent. And we'll of course just add these two back together. And we just want to have this just set up right now so that we can, do a height blend between the two. But actually, let's just show it off first without that, just so we keep things simple. So we're going to want to bring up the world align blend. And it comes up with this big material function here, much like our kind of like lerp blending. And of course you can open this up and look at the extremely kind of complex node that's in there. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create 2 more constants. And we're going to want to convert both of them to parameters and plug it into blend sharpness and blend bias. Now these will be basically what we control, kind of like the strength and fall off of our slope shader. So we can call this blend strength, slope blend strength, and slope blend fall off. And let's just set a value of 2 and 1. Or actually 2 and 0. So these ones are going to need to be played with essentially on your material instance. You have to essentially kind of work them both together. Leaving them at these low values kind of is fine for now. And then, then you just kind of adjust it for each asset depending on whatever your texture is. So now we're going to grab just a regular lerp node, our linear interpolate, and this is essentially going to become our alpha. So we can just drag the alpha into the alpha slot and grab our rock texture, drag that into our B slot, and then our snow into the A. And you should be able to see it update here, which it did not. Oh, that's right, we're not plugged in yet. Plug it into our base color, and it goes all white. And that's because, again, we're going to need to kind of like mess around with these numbers here until we kind of get something that will eventually work for our need. And actually, I have this backwards. You're going to want to make sure that you have your normal base texture in the A slot and your whatever you're essentially being lerping on top into the bottom slot. Kind of a little awkward like that, but there we go. We can start to see things are starting to get in there, and all the snow is essentially layering on top. And of course, with our normal map, we can get it to layer in even nicer, and it'll just kind of like fall on the crevices and the cracks. So we'll just apply this and then take a look at our model. Close that. And here we go. So it's a little too intense right now, so we're going to want to bring up just our material instance and then play around with some of these values. So we'll turn on blend slope, or our slope bend strength, and our blend fall off. And then again, you can just like click when you're hovering over your parameter values and just kind of change these. So you can see the strength is increasing the intensity, and then the fall off will either lessen the kind of amount that you have on there. So going negative values will give you less on the sides, and more will kind of just like cover up the entire asset. Now the great powerful thing about this is that even though our asset here has all this nice snow fall off, if we take our asset and rotate it around, the snow rotates with it. So again, that's why it's kind of called a up vector or just a slope shader. It's always based off the slope. Now it just defaults to essentially the Y direction, but you can set it up to anything. Say you want it to always be on the X-axis and always have, say, moss growing on kind of the north side of your trees, as moss tends to grow, you know, in a northerly direction. So you can do that to create some really cool, unique looks on a bunch of different things. So again, it's not just limited to rocks, but again, you can utilize it for trees, or say there's like a really strong wind current, you know, maybe if you're near the ocean and you want kind of like water effect, just like being on a bunch of your assets that are kind of facing the sea, you get a lot of sea spray. So there's a ton of different applications for this, but you just rotate this around and it will always stay, again, up on the top. And we can just rotate it this way and see that it nicely is staying off the bottom. It's really powerful, gives you a lot of usability and control over your assets, and that way you just duplicate this around, maybe rotate this guy here, and say we kind of had it rotate like this, whatever, not the greatest looking thing right now, but you can see you get a lot of variation, and you didn't really have to like go in and hand paint all this snow in your diffuse texture. Our diffuse texture was relatively simple, you know, as you saw at the start. It was basically just some kind of gray colors to kind of give off the look of this rock. And already with our normal map detail and our slope shading, we've increased the look of this rock tenfold. So again, just some really basic things that can turn this to be pretty powerful. Now, if we want to blend in with our normal map as well, so we get a little bit more variation in, you know, where our snow is kind of falling, we can use our actual normal map to help blend this. So all we have to do is just kind of grab our normal map, plug it into the explicit normal, and then we want to make sure we use explicit normal instead of just alpha right down here, and plug that into our alpha. And it'll just give a little bit more breakup. It's a bit noisier in our kind of like look here. We can also, in here, you'll see the in-world vector, and if you just hover your mouse over, you can see that the default is set to 0, 0, 1, which means the z-axis, sorry, not the y-axis. In Unreal, it's z is kind of the up direction. So if we want to be able to change that, we just bring in a 3 constant, and we can change this to say 1, or I'm sorry, yeah, red is our default, and just plug that in. And then you can see that the snow is kind of always here on the right side. You know, if we were doing a tree with moss, this would be a great way to do it. And of course, you know, you could convert that to a parameter and change it up however you see fit if you need that control. But generally, you know, you're going to be wanting to blend in some either snow or sand or dirt or moss, or even just some extra color in there. So again, this is really powerful, and it's pretty simple to set up. It's just the world aligned blend. To further increase the potential usefulness of our world aligned blend or slope shader or up vector shader is we can add the ability to essentially paint away the actual slope blend itself with a vertex color. So we can choose, like, say, our alpha channel, that if we want to paint in some our alpha vertex color onto our model, it'll no longer have any snow or moss or, you know, dirt buildup in that area. That way we can always keep any specific area nice and just clean of any kind of detail. Now, why would this be useful? Well, let's say you had these kind of rocks here and you had a cliff kind of overhang. And instead of taking a brand new shader that doesn't have this slope shader on here, because maybe only part of this rock was actually covered up, you could easily just come in here with your alpha brush and just paint away some of the snow that you just don't want in this one little specific area. So it'll add a lot of realism to your scene, as it'll feel like this rock is blocking the snow from falling down on this rock here. Now, you of course could just have all these rocks here and there'll be some snow underneath there, but it will just feel a little more unrealistic, and we really want to have that kind of look. These are like subtle little things that players will notice. You know, you have this big old overhang, it's kind of like a cave or something, and then you have some rocks in there that, you know, really shouldn't have any kind of snow on them. And so it'll just seem kind of weird, like, why does this rock have snow on it when it's underneath this overhang? This overhang's catching all the snow. So we can just go and add in that option. So we're going to need a vertex color, and we're going to be using our alpha color basically in the alpha slot. And then we can just go ahead and quickly apply this. And come to one of our assets. Say this guy is just sitting under here. You know, he shouldn't really have a lot of snow on him, as he's underneath the overhang. So we'll want to come into our vertex paint and come to our alpha channel. So that's right here actually. You just want to make sure that you have the alpha checked, and then when you start painting, nothing will happen. Of course, we're painting with white. You can just check that out. Go drop down to the alpha. So what you're going to want to do is, normally on vertex colors, you would just come down here and set this to black and start painting. But if you'll notice when you're doing the alpha channel, nothing's actually happening. There's no vertex color being laid down. And if you come down to your alpha only, you'll also notice that no color is laying down. And that's because for this, you actually need to set the alpha to black and white. It's essentially, normally your alpha is always on, and to get it to paint black is essentially removing your entire alpha. So you'll want to set that to 0. You can also do it right here, and you'll want to make sure these are all set to 1 as they're still laying in color. And then we can come in there and just paint away. And of course, if you want to just check out your alpha channel, you can now see that it's black. And of course, with the shift key and clicking, you can erase that detail. But again, remember, you want to make sure that your alpha is set to 0 when you're painting your alpha. Now, one thing to note about this is that when you do paint this away, and say you rotate your asset where there should be snow again, there will be no snow in that area, even though it's essentially all laying with your faces pointed upwards where you would expect snow to be. Since you did erase that alpha there, you're no longer going to have snow. So you have to come in and remove that. If you bring this asset outside into, into a more snowy area, or if you just want to have some snow on that surface once again. So just remember, in case you ever are duplicating an asset and you're like, okay, yeah, this is cool, duplicate this guy over here, maybe you're starting to use him like in this area over here, and you're rotating him and you're like, why am I not getting any snow up here? Is there something wrong with my shader? No, just remember, if you are painting away your slope, you need to essentially paint it back in. So it can be kind of a bit finicky, but it'll give you a lot of really nice control when you don't want snow or sand or moss in any one given area. So we can just remove a bunch of the snow right there, come to this guy over here, we just want to remove the snow just like right here, just underneath the edge of this rock. And that'll just really help, give this feeling that the snow is just falling right here, right on top of the rock, and where there is, no snow underneath this cliff, of course, we're getting no snow as we'd expect to see. Again, it adds that realism and just really helps sell your scene. Now let's take a look at how we can utilize our mesh's existing vertices to displace them in the world with our shader. This will give us the ability to kind of give more raised up areas and exaggerated vertex push, and give us the effect that the snow has built up and creates larger kind of chunks and clumps on our asset without needing to model that in. So we can do that easily by creating a transform vector, and we'll need to actually get basically the position that we want. And of course, since we want this to be snow, we're going to need to bring in a constant 3 vector and use the blue channel. As of course, like the blue channel is pointing down, so it'll be the snow up here. And of course, if you want to, use the X and Y values, they are essentially like X is here, Y is here. Now, one thing for this is when you're doing this with the transform vector, it's essentially affecting all all vertical vertices. So it'll affect the ones on the top and the ones on the bottom. So to make sure that we only use the ones on the top, the positive side, not the negative side of our mesh, we need to clamp that. So we're just going to clamp our results. Again, a clamp is just going to kind of like make sure that the 0 is zeroed out and the 1s is the 1 max default. And of course, since we're using the blue channel, we need to mask out our blue channel. And so we just want to come down to a component mask, switch this guy up to just isolate the blue channel, as now we want to be able to control the kind of contrast that we're going to get from this. And so we can do that with a power node. I kind of like to think of the power nodes as your contrast nodes, and multiply is essentially adding on top of each other. It's kind of like intensifying it. So we'll create a constant here as we are multiplying, the kind of contrast here against our masked out blue channel. So we can just set this to a default value of, let's just say 1 for right now, and we'll change this to a parameter, and we'll call this vert offset contrast. Now we want to multiply this result by a much higher constant, which will be essentially our offset strength. So we'll convert this one to a parameter and call this vert offset strength. Now, to get the world up position, we're going to need another node called the vertex normal world space. This is going to grab our vertex normal, so whichever direction is always pointing up, it's going to use that. So we can just then again multiply our results by our vertex normal. And if we want to just like take a look at what this is doing, we can just start previewing. And I realized I didn't hook it up, so we just gotta drag it into our world offset. Just plug it in. And I realized I just forgot to actually set a default value. So let's just set 10. It's kind of our default value. And actually, this is not the most helpful preview node, so actually we'll just stop previewing. And if we switch this back to something like 0, we have our normal sphere, but then when we increase it to 10, start to see that the sphere raises up. It'll be a little bit more obvious once we get it on our model. But now that we have this kind of set up, we can just apply it. And we'll close this, grab our instance, and now we can play around with our vertex offset values. So let's just grab one of these guys, drag it over here, and actually remove all of our alpha paint, just so we can see it all over everything. Okay. Now when we change the vertex offset strength, you can see the model is actually deforming. So 10, it's raising it up, and you'll notice that it's only really raising where we have our snow. So if we increase this to 50, it's kind of bulging out, and it's basing on whatever is pointing upwards. And then if we increase the kind of strength or contrast, things start to get a little bit more bumpy. Of course, this is just based off how many verts are on your actual model. So if you don't have a ton of vertices, then you're not going to get the best results. So you need to make sure you watch out for that. But if we set this up to 10, you can start to see it gets pretty craggly, but it is giving us some, nice displacement compared to basically when we had nothing. When we had nothing, we were just like left chilling with this kind of result, and it's like, okay, that's not too bad. But in case we wanted to, offset the snow, make it a little higher, make it feel like it's kind of like packing up and increasing on here. And of course, when we rotate our model, those changes get applied and will bump up whatever values are facing upwards. So it's a great way to just add a little bit extra kind of detail and obviously shader complexity to your asset. But if you want those little extra subtle things to kind of give the look of the snow building up on your asset, you can easily do that. And of course, you can do this with a lot of other things. We can do this with sand or moss. So again, it's just building up nicely on top of there, and of course can change these values all around. Without set it like going too low, we're going to actually start to kind of concave into the mesh. So you will have to be careful about that. So we can come back into our master shader. And instead of just using, a flat vertex color, we can actually use our normal map. And that way we'll get a little bit more kind of detail and noise. You can already start to see it. It starts to break it up a little bit. So we can just apply that. Grab our instance guy, and now you can see, we're just getting a bit more kind of variation out of this. So you don't want to go too far, you start to get these really jagged, spiky areas. It can work really nice for some maybe icicles or just kind of just broken up, variation in the top of your mesh asset. But we'll want to keep it subtle somewhat. And of course, again, it does displace these. And the one issue you will need to be aware of is that it's not displacing the collision of your mesh. So if you have some really nice built-on collision here that you're going to walk on this rock and you start displacing this mesh, the collision is going to stay the exact same. This is just displacing the vertices. So just keep that in mind. To show off another use for vertex offset blending in our shaders that we can utilize to kind of create more dynamic assets, I have this little plane here that has some basic vertex blending, height blending between this stone texture and some snow. We can just quickly take a look at that. It's very much exactly what we've already done and gone over. Nothing new in this shader. We just have our rock height map that is inverting to kind of allow the snow to pile up in the crevices first. We have our contrast using our power node that of course is grabbing our vertex color, and we're adding those two back together to be our height map for our height lerp in our diffuse as well as our normal. Of course, we have our texture coordinates, and these are all parameters so that we can easily change them up. And then just, our specular and roughness, or our metallic and roughness. So again, nothing too complex here. It's pretty simple stuff we've already gone over. But now we're going to utilize that vertex offset and be able to paint up the snow areas with another vertex color to allow us to get some height out of this. And so that should be easily done by utilizing the same technique that we just used on our slope shader. So let's just grab in a 3 constant, get our blue shader, or our blue color. We'll get a transform vector, plug that in. We will want to clamp our results. Again, we'll want to do this as well, in case we're using just our normal map, which we eventually can use, but I'll just quickly show it off with just the simple just upslope. We'll want to mask out the blue channel so we can affect different parts and allow different contrast. So we'll just grab just the blue channel. We'll need a power node. And we'll plug this in. And we'll make a parameter. Call this vert offset contrast. Plug that in. We will then multiply our results by another parameter, our vert offset strength. Plug that guy in. Multiply once again by our vertex normal world space. And now, instead of just plugging this result in, we're actually going to lerp between this and essentially nothing. Because if we just plug this in right now, it'll offset everything that's pointing upwards. So basically all of the terrain on this little piece of mesh, since it's all the normals are facing upwards, it'll push all of them up and we won't really see any results. So we're just going to want to use our normal lerp. Good old linear interpolation friend here. And what we're going to do is we're going to lerp between our result here, which will be in the B slot, so it'll be the kind of bottom version. And then we're going to want to lerp between just this blue channel of nothing, or I'm sorry, we're going to want to blend with our chain here, but where we set our kind of strength here, and we'll want to make sure we set some default values, let's say 10, and here we'll do 5. We're going to want to blend between a strength of 0, as 0 basically means it's not offsetting at all. So we can just multiply, and we can grab our power here, and we'll get a constant of 0. And we won't need to convert this one to a parameter as we're not going to change it. And just plug it in there. And then of course we need to plug in our vertex color. Let's just use the green channel right now. And we'll just plug it into the world offset. Apply that. And wait for it to compile. Now that's compiled, we can just grab our brush, go to our green channel, sure we have our mesh selected. Now, as you can see, when you can't see your brush here, it means that, we already have some kind of green paint already in this guy. So we'll just want to quickly go ahead and erase all of this. And then when we paint, we can increase our vertexes. And so they're raising off the ground. Now, actually, we're just going to want to grab our material instance just so we can see this a bit better. And we'll put the vert strength to, let's say, 50. Now we can go back in here and start to paint up, this snow. So it'll look like we have got this really nice little snow in there. Of course, we can start to paint some of this away as it's getting a little high. But we can come in here and dramatically change this mesh simply just by using the vertex shader. We don't need to go in and kind of like edit the model or anything to create a lot of this height. And this can give you a lot of power control over what your meshes and assets look like. But again, remember, the collision does not follow, so the player will no longer stand up here, he'll stand where the plane originally was. However, sometimes this can actually just be a beneficial thing. For something like snow, generally your feet kind of sink into the snow. We're not going to really have the footprints with that, but it's still, you could still get the sunken look of the shoe in the ground, your foot's kind of buried under the snow. To do, kind of actual snow footprints, that would involve some particles, which we're not going to be going into, as that is a more FX kind of focused topic. But this is just a great way you can just add a lot of really nice detail. Maybe if you had some sand in here, you wanted to raise this up, or just kind of anywhere on some flat meshes. It's a great way to kind of utilize some meshes that you need to kind of seam in between terrain pieces. Let's say the terrain is always essentially going to be the same wireframe throughout. It doesn't really change from, this scale that you see right here. But with our, individual little meshes here, we can add a lot more geometry in there in case you really need to get some fine-tuned detail. And if, maybe you have like a lot of little small character props that you have in your ground, you want to like paint some really nice snow in there, or just paint them so it looks like they're buried underneath your snow. You can easily do that with a just secondary mesh where your terrain mesh might not have the density for that. So again, this is just something to keep in mind, and just with some simple shader tricks you can really kind of create a really nice and powerful mesh. And it just will give your scene a lot more variety and variation when you kind of are undulating the terrain or just the ground planes that you use. One final thing I wanted to show off before we move on from our vertex offset shader is that if you want to have the ability to come in and paint your snow but also have it essentially affect the mesh, we can easily do that by just changing which vertex color we're using. So right now we were using the green channel to kind of, paint the offset in, giving us the control of that. So if we wanted to raise up some of these rocks, we could. But if we wanted to only ever raise the terrain when we paint our snow, we could come in here and hook up our red channel, as again, anything that we paint will be affecting our vertex offset. Now be warned that when you do this, your mesh is going to change pretty significantly. So I'm going to apply this and we can see kind of what happens. So as you can see, it got kind of a lot more bulbousy and bumped out. And now the main reason for that is if you look at the red channel, there's a lot of, kind of areas that have red information that are not necessarily just pure snow. So that is one thing you are going to have to watch out for and kind of play around and find the results that you want if you're going to go this way. But it does give you that kind of cool option of, painting up and, the rocks kind of appearing underneath the snow, or the snow getting built up and giving you some nice undulation. But the obvious problem being that, anywhere you kind of like get this transition, it's always going to bring up, the rocks for a bit before the snow. So it could hurt your essential look of having kind of the snow at the very base of the flat rocks. Again, we can just check out the difference there by plugging back in our green channel and applying that real quick. Wait for it to compile the shaders. And see, this just generally gives a nicer, cleaner result. The snow, we kind of have the choice of where we want to build that up. In some of these areas, we might want the snow to just be really flat. But we do lose a vertex channel when that happens. So it is something to keep in mind if you are kind of struggling for vertex channels. You can then, kind of just play around, try and get some better fall offs that might benefit you. But, of course, you're going to want to have to check this out and see that, like, most of this is kind of red. So if you are painting in, your vertex offset with your red channel as well, you're going to be getting most of this kind of being pushed up. So it is something to keep in mind, but it is an option, and a pretty cool one at that. Now, to round us out on our kind of advanced shaders we're looking at here, I want to show another one, which is bump offset mapping. What this will do is it'll essentially be what's also known as parallax mapping, and it'll kind of fake some height in our detail based off our height map. So we'll just come back to this shader right here, and we're actually just going to swap up our textures just a little bit to get us something that'll show off some better results, as these textures are not the greatest for that. So I'll just come in here and grab some dirt textures that I have. Actually, I'll just go swap them out. Leave my snow. Select my dirt texture from the content browser. Select the dirt's height map. And we'll also grab the normal map. Now, the reason why I'm switching these up is their height map here is just a little bit better done for this kind of bump offset mapping, where we have a lot of really nice high peaked white areas and some really nice black areas. So it will give us this really great look of this kind of like faked effect of kind of like tessellation without actually having tessellation. The rock height map I had wasn't that great for that. It worked well for the blending, but it was a little too soft, and I feel like this one works out a little bit better. So again, it's the same kind of like shader that we have here. I'm actually just going to remove our like green painted snow that we're offsetting, as we just don't need it for right now. We can just leave it here in the shader, and it's not going to hurt anything. But let's just quickly apply this. And now we just have like some snow kind of being painted into, this mud. Now what we're going to do is we're going to be utilizing our height map to essentially, it's going to affect all of our UVs. So to set that up, we just need a bump offset node. And it's pretty simple. All we have to do is just take the height map, plug it into our height, and then what we do is we take the result of this and plug it into the UVs of every one of our textures that it needs. And we'll bring it down here to our normal map as well. Now, if you get this error and you're like, what's up with this? Float to and float are undefined. So the reason for this is when you are plugging in your height map into your height slot, it only registers the red channel map, which is basically just our normal height map, our black and white map here. Now, if you're using a height map and you kind of grab the white channel, Occasionally it has some extra data, so a lot of times when you're dealing with textures that are just flat black and white, you'll want to just grab the red channel just so you can avoid any kind of random issues like this. So if we pop the red channel in there, it's essentially the exact same thing. If this is all four channels, your red, your green, your blue, and your alpha, it comprises this texture. It's the exact same thing as just pulling the red slot channel. This definitely comes into play when you're packing textures. So if you're sampling 3 textures into one texture, so like, you have a black and white for your red channel, you have a different black and white for your green channel, and a different black and white for your blue channel, you'll want to always grab whichever channel you need. So it doesn't technically need to be the red channel, it just has to be one of the 3 channels. It can't be a combination of all 3. So you can easily do that. And another way, if you're grabbing, say, the results of a height map, like let's say we wanted to grab the results here where we're like using our contrast and plugging that in, occasionally you can still get an error. Now, not always, but sometimes we want to take our component mask and we can just easily mask out, say, the red channel. So if you do get an error, you can just always mask out the red channel and plug it in. But for this, we can also, since this is just sampling our texture, we'll just grab that and bring it in here. Now, one thing to note is that you'll want to add in your coordinates separately from just where your height map is plugged in. So right here, we have our texture coordinates that are being plugged into our height map, and then it's fed into here. And you would kind of assume that since this is tiling from this texture coordinates, and you're plugging your bump offset into your UVs, that it would follow through with that tiling. However, it does not. And you actually don't even want your UVs to be tiling based on whatever one of these random things is. You actually kind of want to break it off. So we'll just do that right now. We'll break it off and we'll plug in our height here. Now we can come in here, grab this, if we want to be able to control all our UVs, and set this parameter to bump offset UV. Now we can plug this in not only to our UVs here on our height map, but also our UVs on the coordinate node right here. Now this, when we plug it in here, will feed into our UVs on our diffuse as well as our normal, and any other textures like if we had a roughness or possibly an alpha. So just keep that in mind. And then the last one is this height ratio input. And if we click on the bump offset node, we can see what the default value is. It's 0.05. It's an extremely low number. This is kind of like the base. You almost generally can always leave it pretty much static right there, and you'll still get a fairly good bump offset value without it getting too crazy. The only time you'll want to really expand this is if you're, layering tons of different bump offsets, but I've never really had too much success with that. I've really only found that using like around the default values to be a pretty good one. So we can just come in here and convert this to a parameter. So if we want to change it, we can. We'll just set the default value to 0.05 as it is in our bump offset here, and then just name this parameter bump offset strength. That way we control it with our instance. And so we'll just click apply, wait for it to compile, and then we can just like take a look at it. And instantly you can already see the difference. You can see that more so than your normal map, you're getting a lot of this nice faked detail. It looks like these areas are kind of raised up in geometry, when in reality, they're a completely still flat plane. There's been no added geometry, and it's not actually offsetting any of the detail. We've got a flat plane right here and, a noticeable difference right here. Let's just paint away some of this. Is it the red channel? Yeah, the red channel. So we'll just get rid of some of that real quick so we can see a bit more of this. So again, it's faking this illusion of, height detail here. a lot better than just a normal map alone, which would look something, kind of like this. It's nice, your normal map detail, but it's really not giving it that kind of real chunky faked look that just adds an extra layer to it. And it's a lot cheaper than doing something like tessellation, which would be really expensive and might not give you the best results anyways. So we can just come in here and we can check out our strength, and we'll see how instantly just moving the slider up just a bit can start to really dramatically fake this effect, but also break the illusion. Only some height maps are really going to work well with this. You want them to be really black and white. If you have too much gray, it's going to feel soft and you're not going to get these kind of peaks that are really nice. So you have to be very careful with this and not increase it too much. Otherwise you're going to start to get some really bad artifacting. But for a flat plane, it gives a really nice extra effect that can just add a bit more depth to your scene. All right, let's take a look at our final rock asset and the shader that we created with all the nodes with linear interpolating blends and slope shaders and parallax, and all these features kind of mixed together into one asset. And this is kind of the rock I have right here. It's no longer using a one-to-one sculpted texture, only the one-to-one normal map. Now, of course, on this asset, you totally could. It is your hero rock. You might want to emphasize it a bit more. But I want to show you the power of being able to utilize multiple different tiling textures to create a large array of different looking assets, all with the same asset, and really only needing your normal map for that. We're just going to open up our master material and take a look at everything that we have. So this is the master material that I made. It's just the same thing that I went through in last week's class of using our height controls to do our linear interpolations, as well as things like our slope shader, our bump offsets, and our detail normal maps. So these are all the things that are just combined into one. And I tried to give these nice little comment boxes just so it's easier for myself to kind of come back and just check these things out. The only thing that added in here was just a quick roughness from my diffuse map. So what I did there was I took the end linear interpolation after I blended my final kind of colors. In this example here, I'm really only blending the red channel and the green channel to blend two different types of rocks. I still have the blue and alpha option, or at least the alpha option still available. I use the blue channel to either remove slope if I didn't want it. Default, I always want slope to be there, but if I needed to essentially paint away snow or grass or sand, I can do that with the blue channel. So that still leaves the alpha channel left open, which I didn't hook anything up in this final shader, but I totally could if I wanted to blend in another texture. So I took the red vertex color channel. It's lerping with my base diffuse texture. It's just this generic tiling texture. Of course, on yours, you can use your one-to-one sculpted and kind of like detailed out diffuse texture if you want. I just use a tiling diffuse as, that's how we made a lot of the rocks in Madagascar and the Western Ghats. We weren't really using one-to-one diffuse textures. We were using one-to-one normal maps on things to kind of help accentuate some of these larger shapes, but we used a lot of just tiling textures. So this, of course, blends. The first blend is with just another tiling rock texture. We then also, again, blend with another tiling rock texture. And what I did here was I copied my height control that I use of the first rock that has a nice just height map. I duplicated this and used it to control the green's height channel. So before, I was always taking whatever my height channel was, plugging it into the height texture for my height lerp and using the same one in my earlier demos. But on this, I want to use the height map for this rock texture, as it'll give you the height control that you want. And since this is channeling the green texture, I just named it green control height, or green color height control. And generally that's how I kind of like to name things. Some people have different naming conventions. Either if it's a soft surface, they might want to, name these parameters soft surface, but I generally find it easier to name them after the vertex color you're using. So here I am using my green channel for my vertex colors, and it's my second height lerp. So everything here is named green color height control. Same with the parameters, same with the fall off that hooks up to the normal map height lerp for this same green channel blend. And again, down here I have my green color normal. We're using our strengthening technique as well. We're masking out the red and green channel. We're strengthening it by a parameter. So all in all, once I get done with blending my diffuse textures, and before I get into my slope, I want to create some roughness for my rocks. And so I just bring it in that color and I mask out the red channel, as I just want a nice black and white. We can just take a quick preview of this. So again, since it is a roughness, I don't want a bunch of color, I just want the black and white values. So I'm just bringing in a component mask and just selecting the red channel. I'm then using a power to kind of be able to control the contrast, and this is just my roughness contrast. Again, converted into a parameter. I also clamp these values as I don't want them, to skyrocket and have the whites just blow out and the blacks, just bottom out. So I clamp that at 0 to 1. I multiply that by a roughness intensity, and then I lerp that with the roughness of my slope. Now the reason for that is a lot of times, your slope is going to be a different texture, a different look than what your main base rock is going to be. Your rock is just going to be, pretty flat. You could even get away with just a static constant for your roughness. It won't be as good. Having some of this variation, some of these like lighter areas and dark areas will give you, a bit more pop if you don't have a roughness texture already created for it. Again, this is just simply if you are just wanting to take your roughness from your diffuse. But I grab my slopes roughness texture, which I brought in, and then again I do the same thing with a power constant and a multiply just to up the intensity. And I clamp both these results as, I want to have a little bit more control, make sure the values don't get too out of whack. And then I just lerp these two results, and I use the alpha for the lerp is based off my slope, my world align blend here, which is of course the alpha for my lerp between my rocks that come in and my slope texture. This again all just feeds into my base color. And I just have, some contrast available here for my AO. I'm using the AO of my 1-to-1 baked normal map as I just want to kind of push those forms a bit more. We also down here have our detail normal map. Again, fairly simple. Just masking out the red and green channel, multiplying it by a strength parameter, and then we're appending these values back together, and I'm appending a 0 as that's going to be acting as our blue channel, as we don't want this to be anything beyond just kind of getting those red and green little extra bits of information. We append this at the very end, we add this together at the very end with both of our height lerps for our normal texture. So again, this is our green height lerp, and this is our red height lerp, which is again connected up here for our texture for our red channel up here and our green channel over here. I also did a unique normal map that I am doing the same technique as our detail normal map, and the only difference is I'm stacking this on top. So again, I'm bringing out the strength and I'm keeping the tiling at 0. I don't connect the UVs to anything as I don't want this to tile since it is a unique 1-to-1 map. And this is actually skipping all of these other nodes, and it's being brought all the way here to add together with my final height lerp. So once I've painted my red channel and get the normal map from there, and then I'm painted green, I'm adding my unique normal map back with this result. And then finally, that is being added again to my detail normal map, which eventually is going to lerp with my snow normal map, which of course is affected by our world align blend to get the normals, so that when the snow or grass is on top, it is sampling our normal slope shader and our normal slope normals. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's sampling our slope normals instead of our rock. That way it looks like the snow kind of has covered up the entire area. Now, if you don't want that and you want some of your normals to kind of come through, you of course can even paint away this texture and, possibly using the alpha channel, as we still have that available, and painting away some of this normal map and just allowing and doing another linear interpolation blend and blending out the alpha there. I'm sorry, blending out just the flat normals of our snow texture. So instead of seeing something like just some kind of flat snow, you might want to be able to paint in your alpha color right here and get those rocks to kind of just poke out and look like they've been lightly dusted. So again, that's another option. That's kind of the benefit of having 4 channels to play with. You can easily control them however you want. I added some simple bump offset. I left the default values kind of the same. I plug in my height texture from, and again, I'm bringing my red channel of my height map into the height slot, and then the coordinates are, my red color UVs. Again, I like to name it, the red color, so I know that when I paint with this, or when I adjust the instance parameters in my instance shader, I know that I'm affecting this same texture. This same texture is going to be also affecting, my red color height map, and my whatever my red channel texture is going to be. It just makes it a lot simpler. So it gets plugged into the coordinates, and then of course the result of that gets plugged into my normal map and my diffuse texture. And if I had a roughness texture, it would also plug into there. And this just gives an extra little bit of kind of some added detail. It's nothing too extreme. It's pretty subtle. It just adds in a little bit more pop than just your normal map would. It's definitely not needed, and sometimes it can be really subtle, especially on rocks. It works probably best when you have a really harsh black and white normal map. Like this one doesn't do the greatest job, as it does have a lot of gray in there. So you really want to look for something that has a lot of just kind of like black to white, as it'll give that really steep kind of like height look to it. You of course can add in again another kind of power and multiply node to try and accentuate the peaks and valleys of this for that, to get the bump offset to kind of like pop out a bit more. But I generally find it better working for things like tiles and mud, things that are on the ground. Sometimes it just might not hold up as well on rocks, and that's why I keep it fairly subtle. And I do that with both the red and green. I just leave the default values there. And that's pretty much it, I think. I know it is a pretty big shader and pretty big crazy one to go through, but the simple thing is just you'll want to start with something simple when building this shader. Just bring in some textures, kind of follow the steps from the examples that I gave, and just constantly build on. You can easily just create your slope shader and be like, oh, okay, I got this working, and then be like, you know what, I just need to actually check how my height maps or what my textures are looking like without the slope. And you can just come in here and disconnect your slope shader, and that way you'll just be looking at your diffuse textures, and so you can easily blend those together. So it's just easy to kind of just do it in parts, go one by one, figure out what works best for you. You can easily copy and paste these things from one shader to the next. So if you were, doing each kind of demo in its own master material, you can easily just copy and paste them from one to the other. That definitely saves up a bunch of time, which is really nice. And lastly, use comment boxes. They're pretty helpful for this. But one more thing we'll want to check out and do is for some of our textures that we want to change, such as the slope textures, like the slope base color, the slope roughness, and the slope normal, you come down here and convert it to a parameter, and that will give you the option in our instance material to just go ahead and switch up what these textures actually are. That way you can kind of plug and play. And in reality, you can do that with all of your textures. Ones that I find to be pretty helpful will be like your detail normal map, as you might want to switch that up. It can really depend on what you're using, what kind of look you're going for, as well as your base normal map. If you're switching this up with a few different rocks that you've sculpted, then you're going to want to be able to have the ability to easily just swap up your kind of large cliff material and just swap out the normal map. So we can just quickly apply and save our shader, and then just take a look at how we can work with this. So we'll look at our master. Of course, we can duplicate and create a material instance, and we can just name it something like, maybe this is Cliff B. And so we can just drag this into our instances and move it there. And then so I have got a bunch right now, but we can see we have a lot of different options to kind of play around with. These are all the options that we've converted to parameters, and we can change them up, and so that each kind of version gets a different look to them. We can just take a look at that right now. So I've got this one here that's snowy. It's kind of got more smoother, large surfaces. We also have this one with grass on it, and the grass is just really kind of up on the top. It's not really kind of blending off the sides as much as the snow is. It's a bit chunkier. It's the exact same model, just throwing in some different vertex paint and different different parameters in here. We can easily just change this up and give ourselves a totally different look. We can come in here for the default was 4. If we're that's a little blurry, you can just come in here and then change it to be whatever it was. Go back to our default, or maybe just increase it quite a lot so that you just have a really nice detailed look when you're up super close. And then of course we can kind of come down to some of these other options, like our slope roughness intensity, and just kind of play around with them and see what kind of results we get. Maybe a -2 value. Oh, that was actually just for the roughness for our slope there. Here's the one I was looking for, actually. Our slope, blend, and bias, the kind of sharpness. So we can just kind of increase these. Our roughness was actually just controlling how rough this surface is, which of course is very helpful if we want to increase this to make it look a little wet. We kind of just increase that wetness quite a bit. Or if we want to make it more stone-like, just a little just less specky and noisy, we can just decrease that quite a lot. But our blend bias, set this down really low so it's only blending in just a little, or we can increase it quite a significant amount so the grass starts to grow everywhere. And with our shader, since we did plug in our alpha or our blue channel to control our slope, as we can see just right here real quick, in our slope shader, we're using the blue channel into the alpha of our world align blend, we can just come in and grab our model, go down to the blue channel, and just start painting either some of this grass, or we can just paint it away from specific areas. You know, maybe we don't want all of this grass all over the place, but we like it in some areas. We're like, okay, you know what? I feel like it's not going to grow right here. This area might get hit by a lot of wind, or, you know, maybe if we have like another rock right here when we don't want too much grass growing between them, we can easily remove it there. And you know, you can just kind of come back and then paint from that slope. So I already painted away some of it just so, you know, you can kind of see what that kind of effect gives. But it's pretty cool. It allows you to just paint away that slope. You can do the same on the top of your rock. If you're like, all right, this is just, you know, a bit much, I'm just gonna kind of like erase some of it, you know, and you might want to just take your intensity down, and then you can always paint it back. You know, and since we're using not only our red height map, but our green height map, it kind of fills in those little gaps. You know, it tries to fill in those gaps first, depending on, you know, what your texture is. So this is a great way just to get some nice variation, even in our slope. Now, you don't have to use just a kind of either snow or dirt or mud, or, you know, even in like this example, kind of like a sand texture. Here I'm actually using a small rock debris texture to blend with my rock asset. So it has this just more of a large kind of like cliff rocky look to it. And of course, you know, I can kind of come in here and do all these different kind of changes to this asset. You know, if I'm feeling like, oh, it's a little too chunky there, you know, or maybe it's not, you know, rubbly enough right here, I can come into these areas and just kind of like paint them and erase different sections as well. And I can erase two at once just to come back to kind of like, you know, a nice default. But it just gives you a lot of different options. The one thing you will have to remember or be careful of is if you do paint one texture down, you know, your green channel is generally always going to stack on top of, you know, whatever you lay in. So even though I'm painting red in here right now, the red channel isn't coming through. That's because it's technically underneath the green channel, and they don't really have a way in Unreal, unfortunately, to kind of just paint both, I guess, because if you paint even with both of them at the same time, it's just going to bring, you know, your green channel in on top. So you'd have to come in, if you wanted to bring out the red, then just to kind of like paint away the green, and then you can easily come in here and check that and be like, oh, okay, yeah, there's like a ton of green, but there's also a bunch of red there. And so to get rid of this green, or to see the red, I need to get rid of my green. However, you know, if you want green in there, you know, it's always going to lay on top of your red. So just keep that in mind, as that can kind of affect you. But this was just to really show that you don't need to have rocks with, you know, just a moss or a snow or sand on them to, you know, get a unique and different look. You can easily use other kind of rocks as your slope. And, you know, I can come in here and kind of paint away, you know, some of these rocky little rubbly pieces on here. And this instance is just using it's the exact same way as my other materials are set up. It's just instead of the slope being the snow texture, it's just using a rubbly rock texture. And of course we're using our normal map and our roughness for this. And of course it just has some different random values that you just kind of want to play around with and figure something out. And so here's just another quick example of how useful this is. So I can just hide these two rocks real quick, as they're exactly the same as this rock asset. And all I did was just rotate and scale them or just rotate them around and add some different vertex color on there. So you can see this guy up in the front here, it's pretty craggly, you know, it really kind of focus in on some of those smaller, chunkier details in the front. Whereas this guy over here is got a lot of smoother, flat shapes, you know, kind of has a nice clean read. And this rock over here is just kind of like plugged in between the two of them, so you don't notice that much the same kind of repetition. Of course, you know, we do have some repeating elements, such as this kind of crack right here. You know, it's kind of coming back here. And the only way to kind of disguise that is to use smaller assets. And that's where our secondary and tertiary shapes are going to come into play. So when you're building your level, just kind of go through with your large cliff shapes and kind of block those in first. You know, get them in there, rotate them around, scale them, find out what works best for you. And ideally, I would say don't focus on vertex blending them right away. That's kind of a step you want to leave towards the end when you're like, oh, okay, this is getting a little too repetitive. I need, you know, something to change this. Kind of leave it, you know, make one, get it to look pretty cool, and then start to add in, you know, your large rock shapes. And you can come back later, and when you find those areas that just have too much repetition in them, have, you know, too many repeating elements, that's when you'll want to come in and just start painting these out to highlight specific areas. As most of the time, you know, when you are running through a space, you're not going to notice the exact same rock over and over again unless it's way too unique. So we'd want to just like start to set up some rocks like this, depending on, you know, how your level is. Again, the biggest takeaway is keep it small and self-contained at the start and expand later. But we'll want to get these larger kind of just shapes in there, and you can just rotate these any way you want, which is great about the slope shader. And then once you have some of your large kind of shapes and reeds in there, is when you're going to want to come back in with your secondary rocks and your, you know, kind of tertiary shapes, you know, your trees, or I mean, you know, depending, those could be your secondary forms as well. But you'll just want to get those kind of big broad shapes in, and then you'll want to go in for some more secondary forms. And of course, with this shader, you can easily use the shader that we created here for your rocks and your boulders. So one thing I like to actually do is, unless I'm going to use this exact same shader, I like to just kind of like create the big shader network and then duplicate it off. You know, I'll generally have one shader that is kind of a master shader for all my cliffs, as there are some things you might want to change about, you know, your cliff shader, that you only want to affect large forms. And then there can be other differences you might want to have, little subtle tweaks inside the shader itself for maybe your smaller boulders. And you might not want to create just thousands of different parameters to change. It's totally possible, you can do it, some people do it that way. I just would rather just kind of come in here, duplicate this, and, you know, maybe call this boulders. That way I essentially have just copied this shader, and anything, you know, I want to change, I easily can, but now I can just kind of come in and create a material instance, move that there, and then, you know, I can kind of come in here, grab one of my rocks or my boulders, and I'll just grab that instance. And now when I bring my boulder in, I still have the option to kind of, you know, adjust all the same settings I want to, but if I want to change some large scale parameter changes within the master shader, you know, for something that is smaller, that is closer up to the player, that might need more detail, or, you know, might need less detail, in fact, I easily have that option. So you can just easily drag this in there. And so, you know, this is when you'll want to start coming in with your secondary details and just start kind of like merging them all together. And, you know, of course, you'll want to use some of these assets and kind of funnel the player, you know, where is your main view? If, my main view is going to be something over here. If there's like maybe like a little cabin, I'll want to start to draw the player this way, use my rock shapes to kind of help assist the player and their view. Figure out ways to draw the eye that way. Like, what are different kind of like rock shapes and pointing forms. Like, we can bring this guy in here, just sink him into the ground, and use it as kind of like a directionality, kind of like a pointer. It's helping you lead the player into this space. If a player is back here and they see a rock that's just kind of pointing this way, it's helping to draw the eye in this direction. And this is the way we want the player to kind of be funneled, or to go to find whatever their next objective is, or their next point of interest. So you can use your secondary rock assets to do that, as well as kind of blend out these larger shapes. We kind of come from these big cliffs to these more bouldery shapes that kind of will help fill out a lot of these spaces and make it feel like these large boulders kind of broke off these cliffs as they're at the base. And of course you can turn off, kind of like the snapping. For organic environments, I never keep any kind of snapping on there, as they are organic. Nature's very chaotic, and doesn't really conform to rigid kind of placement of things. For some things like spirals, nature can create some very rigid patterns, but generally for like falling rocks and everything, they will like to fall towards the area of least resistance. And if you're trying to snap it to like 90 degrees, you're not going to get just that really nice kind of angle that you might want. So this is again why I suggested creating 2 rock boulder assets that don't really have a unique normal map. And again, since this is a shader that's been broken off, we can easily come into our master material for our boulder, which still unfortunately had our ambient occlusion of our unique 1-to-1, as well as our unique normal map, which we no longer need. So we can just get rid of that by disconnecting it right here and just adding this and just kind of removing the unique normal map from it. So again, this is why I like to break it up for some of these smaller assets. So we can just hit apply, and now our boulders will no longer have kind of like the AO or the normal map from our 1-to-1 assets, which is exactly what we want. We don't want them to have that weird normal map on there that only really fits for the sculpted things. So this is kind of like what I'm expecting to see from students, utilizing your knowledge of creating these kind of advanced shaders and showcasing that you can make a slope shader. You aren't going to need to use a slope shader. It is there as kind of something that can help you out, but it's of course not necessary. But it is an extremely powerful shader and something you might want to look into using. Again, I showed right here how you don't need to have moss or sand or snow. You can blend away with utilizing the slope of some rock pebbles. That's a great place for rocks to kind of just fall and just lay just on an area that's like a flat surface. So if this guy was rotated here, a lot of these rocks are going to kind of just fall on these areas that are just a flat plane, and then I can come back in with my vertex color and just kind of get rid of some of them in some of these areas, and kind of just keep them in areas like cracks and crevices. So just think about what can work for you and work for your shaders and your asset needs. Let's take a brief recap of what we learned this week. We learned how we can add additional shader features to advance our normal maps. We learned how to add a tiling detail normal map texture so that our assets will feel high res when you're up close, faking that kind of extra little detail, as well as how to localize and target just specific channels of our normal map to increase the intensity. We looked at a slope shader or an up vector shader in Unreal and how we can utilize this extremely powerful shader to create the effect of snow building up on rocks, or sand or moss building up even on just smaller wood assets. The slope shader is a great one for any kind of assets that you want to use and you want to have some kind of texture detail layered on the top. We also took a look at how you can change not just the up direction, but you could even have it on the side, say for moss on the side of a tree. We took a look at mesh vertex displacement in Unreal and how we can displace the vertices that we already have in our mesh either up or down, giving us the ability to kind of expand our palette of uses for just our regular mesh. We saw that we could take a regular flat plane and paint in some of these vertices, paint it upwards to give a look of depth and model detail without actually having to model any assets. We took a look at parallax or bump offset in Unreal. This just gives us the ability to use our height map to kind of fake and exaggerate some extra detail a little bit stronger than our normal map would. We don't need to highly tessellate something, which will slow down engine performance and is generally not used on every single asset in your scene, while still getting that essentially that look of a highly tessellated asset. It's great for just faking some details, especially on things that have a strong black and white normal map, such as like tile or maybe some grading, like, grading on the floor, or even like window treatment. We also took a look at how we can use our master shaders and everything that we've learned in this week as well as last week, and all combining them all into one to create one really great master organic shader, especially for our rocks. We saw that we might want to split them up and have essentially two different master shaders, one for our larger cliff assets that'll be kind of seen farther away, as well as one for our closer up assets like our large boulders and smaller rocks. We can utilize the ability to swap textures easily so that we only have to rely on our instance shaders to really just kind of play around and get a bunch of different looks for our scene. Let's take a look at what our assignment will be for this week. I want to see students demonstrate their ability to create the following advanced shader techniques. We'll want to see detailed normal maps and how you can utilize those in your own assets for things that need to be more detailed close up. You can use this with just any kind of nice tiling normal map. Anything that doesn't have a lot of really deep detail and anything that's too unique and stands out. Something that's just kind of a good noise will make a great detailed normal map, and you can just tile a lot to really get just some kind of, extra look when you're up close. We'll want to see students showcase their ability to create a slope shader and show off how they can use it in their own scene. Now, I also showed that if you don't need to essentially blend in, either sand or dirt or moss or grass on top of your asset and always need it pointed up, you can easily use it for other aspects, such as, rock rubble on the top of, a rock, or maybe you need moss growing up on the sides of your trees. There's a lot of different avenues you can take this. So you're not just limited to rocks with, moss or snow on them. So just try and find something that would utilize these techniques for your scene. Also want to see students demonstrate the ability to utilize mesh vert displacement. Now you can just do this on a single plane, just show that you have the ability to use it in case you need to create some kind of asset where you're like, hey, I need to displace some of these, verts, get a little bit of extra detail in there, and just have that extra flexibility in your back pocket if you need it. We'll also want to see students demonstrate their ability to do some parallax or bump offset mapping. Now, with parallax mapping, The key is you want to have a really nice, good height map. Generally, it's pretty black to white, not a ton of gray, as you won't really notice the gray that much. This generally works really well on things like tiles or stone, things that can really have a nice, good pop out effect. If you don't really have any of these things in your scene, just look for other ways that you could maybe incorporate it, just so we can see that you have this ability to demonstrate this, as it is something that is used in games a lot, as it is a great way to fake a bunch of extra detail in those kind of examples of like tiles or stonework that I mentioned before. We'll also want to see this created in a master shader, and I would like to see you splitting up two shaders, one for your large cliffs and one for your boulders and your rubble pieces. We're really just looking to see that you have an understanding of creating a master shader, breaking it off into instances, and how you can swap out textures pretty easily for your either cliffs or boulders if need be. It's mainly just we want to see the master shader kind of encompassing a lot of these aspects. And finally, now that we've moved past our block out phase for just our large cliffs, we want to start getting in a lot of these rock details. I want to see a really good pass on your scenes with your larger cliff structures kind of in your scene, starting to add some of those secondary and tertiary shapes in there of the larger boulders and rubble, and then starting to paint away some of this blend with your terrain blending that we've learned in the previous weeks. We want to see you be able to start to paint them out, start making these boulders and cliffs feel like they're integrated into the scene. You don't need your final pass on this. We just want a nice, good, quick pass to see what your assets are doing and how they're all interacting with each other. All right. I know it's a kind of a technical week. Next week, we're going to hit up some foliage assets and the importance that they will play. So focus this week on finalizing all your rocks and everything you need for that, and start getting them into your scene so we can really start to build out this great space that you all are working very hard on.